Hey guys, today I bring you an incredible and transformative story that will move you. I will tell the impressive account of Asher Hawthorne, a young man who went through a near-death experience and received a surprising revelation about the future of humanity. Before we dive into this exciting journey, I want to know, what city are you watching from? Comment below. And, of course, if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any content like this. Let's go. My name is Asher Hawthorne. I'm not a writer, nor a speaker, just an ordinary person who went through something extraordinary that completely changed the way I see life. I've been thinking a lot about sharing this story, but I feel like I need to tell you what happened to me that night in Denver in 2014. At the time, I was a 27-year-old young man, recently graduated in administration, working at one of the biggest consulting companies in the city. My life followed exactly the script that many would consider ideal. I had a well-paid job, my own apartment in the city center, and in the eyes of everyone, as especially my parents, I was the example of professional success. But the truth is, inside, I felt completely empty. My weeks were filled with endless spreadsheets, reports that all looked the same, and meetings that dragged on for hours. I remember looking out the window of my office on the 20th floor and wondering if this was really the life I had dreamed of for myself. My mother, Margaret, always had a special sensitivity to noticing when something wasn't right with me. The times she visited me, her eyes would study me with concern as I tried to convince her that everything was okay. "You look tired, son," she would say, and I would respond with a forced smile, assuring her that it was just normal work stress. The mornings always started the same way. I woke up at 6 a.m., drank a coffee while checking emails on my cell phone, and dragged myself to another day of work. Evenings were no different. I often found myself alone in the office late, surrounded by papers and presentations that needed to be ready for the next day. I lived on autopilot, as if I was just existing, not really living. The days blended into each other, and that sparkle of excitement I had in my eyes when I graduated from college had completely faded. It was like I was stuck in a rut that was draining my life energy, but I couldn't find the strength or motivation to change. I never imagined that I would need something as extreme as a near-death experience to make me see the true meaning of life. But that's exactly what happened that night in March, when fate decided to shake me in the most intense way possible. What I'm about to tell you now may seem hard to believe. I confess that if someone told me something similar before this experience, I would probably doubt it. But I can guarantee that every word I will share is true and has completely changed my way of seeing existence and my role in the world. It was on a Wednesday. I remember it vividly because I had an important presentation for the board the next day, and I was determined to get everything ready before going home. The clock was already showing 23:20 when I finally turned off the computer. The building was practically empty. Only the cleaning staff and a few workaholics like me still walked through the silent corridors. As I walked out the building's revolving door, I felt the cold Denver air hit my face. The city was different that night, covered in a dense fog that gave the streetlights an almost supernatural appearance. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of some sirens and the occasional noise of the few cars that were still circulating at that hour. I was so exhausted I could barely think straight. My legs felt heavy after 14 hours of sitting, and my head throbbed from staring at the computer screen. I decided to walk to the bus stop 3 blocks away, thinking that the fresh air might help me wake up a little. At the last corner before the stop, I stopped at the traffic lights as I always did. The red light for cars came on, and the pedestrian lights turned green. I started crossing the street as I had done hundreds of times before. That's when it all happened. The sound came first, tires screeching on wet asphalt, an engine accelerating instead of braking. When I turned my head toward the noise, I was blinded by a high beam that seemed to be coming directly toward me. My body froze. You know that story about how life passes like a movie in the last moments. It wasn't quite like that. There was no time for anything. The impact was something that words cannot adequately describe. It was like every cell in my body exploded at the same time. I felt my body being thrown, and for a split second I had the strange sensation of flying. Then came the pain, a pain that transcends any known scale, something so intense that my brain seemed unable to process it. I remember lying on the asphalt, feeling the cold and damp against my back. Agitated voices began to form around me, people screaming for help, someone telling me not to move. A woman held my hand and kept repeating that the ambulance was on the way. that I needed to hold on tight. The pain began to turn into a strange tingling, and my vision became blurry at the edges, as if someone was gradually dimming the lights. The sounds began to become distant, as if I were submerging in water. The last thing I heard clearly was the sound of approaching sirens, and then everything went dark. It was at that moment that something extraordinary began to happen. The pain, which until then was unbearable, simply disappeared, and I, who seconds before had been stuck on the cold asphalt, began to experience a sensation that would change my understanding of life and death forever. Suddenly, all the commotion on the street, the desperate voices and sirens, seemed to be happening far away from me. It was like waking up from a heavy dream, but in a way I had never experienced before. I found myself floating above the scene of the accident, as if I were watching it all from a high floor of a building. Down below, I could see my body lying on the asphalt. It was a surreal feeling to see myself like that, as if I were looking at someone else. The team of paramedics had just arrived and were working frantically. Prominent among them was a tall, grey-haired doctor, who I would later learn was Dr. Elijah Green. He looked so focused, his hands moving with precision as he tried to bring me back. The most impressive thing was how I felt. All that excruciating pain was completely gone. In its place, I experienced an indescribable lightness, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from my shoulders. It was a feeling of peace so profound that even today I have trouble finding the words to describe it. As I watched the movement below, I began to notice that the reality around me was changing. The environment began to be filled with a soft light, unlike anything I had ever seen before. It wasn't like sunlight, nor like artificial light. It was something purer, more welcoming. It was as if this light had its own consciousness, as if it knew me and embraced me. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. A presence materialized next to me. It was Gabriel. Even now, years later, I have trouble describing it adequately. He had an appearance that transcended our normal understanding of beauty. He was wearing a white cloak that seemed to be made of light, and a shining golden sword hung at his waist. But what struck me most were his eyes. They conveyed a compassion and wisdom that seemed infinite. Gabriel didn't need to say anything. His presence communicated everything I needed to know at that moment. When he reached his hand toward me, I felt no fear. It was as if I had known him forever, as if that meeting was something natural, expected. Below us, I could still see Dr. Green and his team working tirelessly. People gathered on the sidewalks, some crying, others praying. I watched as my wallet fell out of my pocket and someone picked it up to give it to the paramedics. I watched as they finally managed to get me into the ambulance. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion. The driver who had hit me was sitting on the sidewalk, with his face in his hands, clearly in shock. It's curious how, even in that situation, I didn't feel angry with him. From where I stood, I could see how small, fragile, connected we all were in some way I had never realized before. When I accepted Gabriel's outstretched hand, I felt like I was being enveloped by that welcoming light. The crash scene began to dissolve, and I knew I was being taken somewhere beyond our physical reality. There was no fear, there was no doubt, just a deep certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Gabriel led me to a place that I can only describe as some kind of cosmic movie theater. There were no defined walls. It was as if the space itself was made of light. Before us, images of my life began to emerge, but they were not simple projections. It was like living every moment again, feeling every emotion, but now with a completely different perspective. The first scene I saw was when I was 5 years old. It was a Sunday morning, and I was helping my mother Margaret make pancakes. I remember spilling flour all over the kitchen, but instead of getting mad, she laughed and started a flour fight with me. The interesting thing is that now, I wasn't just reliving the joy of that moment. I could also feel the unconditional love emanating from her, something that my childhood perception hadn't fully captured. The scenes continued to flow. I saw the day I got my first bike, the pride in my father's eyes as he taught me how to ride. I saw the afternoons playing with my younger brother in the backyard, the silly fights we had, and the reconciliations. Each moment came loaded not just with memories, but with deeper meanings that I had never realized before. But not everything was happy moments. I also saw the times I was cruel to classmates at school, when I made fun of a boy because of his thick glasses. In that moment, I could feel the pain I caused him, how those words affected his self-esteem for years. I saw the times I ignored people in need of help on the street because I was too busy, the times I lied to benefit myself, the times I let down people who trusted me. The most surprising thing was that there was no judgment in this review. Gabriel remained beside me in silence, but his presence conveyed understanding, not condemnation. It was as if the purpose of that experience was not to make me feel guilty, but to help me understand the impact that each of my actions had on the world and the people around me. I saw moments that I had completely forgotten, like the day I helped an elderly woman cross the street and she blessed me with tears in her eyes. At the time, I thought it was just a simple gesture, but now I could see how that moment of kindness had brightened her day as she was going through a particularly difficult time. Scenes from my recent professional life were especially revealing. I saw how my obsessive quest for success had made me increasingly distant from the people I loved. I saw the family dinners I missed, the calls from my mother that I didn't answer, the birthdays I forgot, all in the name of the work and status that I thought was so important. It was as if every moment of my life was a small piece of a larger puzzle, and for the first time I could see the whole picture coming together. Every action, every choice, every word spoken or unspoken had consequences that extended far beyond what I could imagine. Gabriel still hadn't said a single word, but he didn't need to. The message was clear. Our lives are an interconnected web of relationships and choices, and every small gesture has the power to create ripples of impact in the world around us. While the last images of my life review were still echoing around me, something extraordinary happened. The light that filled the room began to intensify, but in a way that didn't hurt the eyes. It was as if the light itself was alive, pulsing with love and wisdom. It was then that he appeared. I can't explain how, but I instantly knew it was Jesus. It wasn't like the images we see in paintings or churches. It was something much deeper, more real. His presence carried an indescribable majesty, but at the same time, it was incredibly welcoming. The love that emanated from him was so intense that it made me cry, not with sadness, but with a joy I had never experienced before. He approached me with a smile that seemed to contain all the compassion in the universe. When he spoke, his voice was both soft and powerful, as if each word carried the weight of eternity. Asher, the life you lead has a purpose, even when you don't see it. Every little action, every choice has a purpose, value. I remained silent, absorbing every word. Jesus continued, and as he spoke, images began to form around us. I saw people going about their daily routines, a janitor cleaning hospital hallways, a teacher preparing late-night classes, a bus driver helping an elderly man up the steps. "See the janitor who cleans the hospital corridors," Jesus said, pointing to the image. "He ensures that health and dignity are maintained. His work allows doctors and nurses to save lives in a clean and safe environment. Everyone has a role to play." As he spoke, I began to truly understand the meaning of work, not just mine, but each person's. I saw how each function, no matter how simple it seemed, was part of something bigger, like a great web of interconnected purposes. Jesus then turned directly to me, his eyes penetrating to the depths of my soul. "You have lost yourself in the search for success as the world defines it, forgetting to look for the true meaning of your journey. The work you do is not, it's less important than any other, but it's the intention with which you do it that needs to change." His words hit me like waves of truth, making me see how I had allowed myself to be consumed by empty ambition, forgetting to live with purpose and compassion. I realized that it wasn't the work itself that was wrong, but the way I approached it, and how I allowed it to dominate my entire existence. "Every person who crosses your path is an opportunity to make a difference," he continued. "Every meeting, every email, every hallway conversation, all are sacred moments if lived with love and awareness." As Jesus spoke, I felt as if veils were being removed from my eyes. I began to see how I could turn my daily work into something meaningful, how every interaction could be an opportunity to bring more light into the world. Jesus' expression subtly changed, becoming more serious. The environment around us also seemed to transform, as if the air itself had become thicker with the importance of what was to come. He placed his hand on my shoulder, and at that moment, I felt an indescribable energy course through my entire being. "Asher," he began, in a voice that seemed to resonate through time. "Between the 6th and 10th of November, there will be a divine intervention." As he spoke, I saw images forming around us, like reflections in water. They were scenes from the future, but I couldn't make them out clearly. "The world will enter a period of transformation and spiritual renewal." I felt the weight of those words. It wasn't just information being shared, it was a responsibility being entrusted to me. Jesus continued, "It is important that you have faith and be ready to help others understand what is coming. Trust in the greater plan." There was a gravity in his voice that made me understand that this wasn't just another moment in my experience. It was a mission being assigned. I realized that being there, receiving that message, was no coincidence. The accident that almost took my life had a greater purpose than I could have imagined. "Many will not understand at first," he explained, "and some will fear the changes that will come. Your role is not to convince anyone, but rather to be a light of hope and understanding for those who seek answers." I saw tears forming in my eyes as I took in the magnitude of that moment. Jesus then smiled gently and continued, "Do not be afraid. You will not be alone on this journey. Just as Gabriel is here now, there will always be help available for those who seek to serve with love." At that moment, I felt a deep certainty settle in my heart. It wasn't just about my personal life or my career anymore. It was about being part of something much bigger. It was about being present and aware to help others during a time of significant transformation. "Remember," Jesus added, "strength is not in great actions, but in the constancy of love and faith in each small gesture. When people begin to question and seek answers, be a listening ear and an open heart." Gabriel, who had remained silent by my side this entire time, nodded in agreement. Their presence together created an atmosphere of power and peace that words cannot adequately describe. "The time is near," Jesus concluded, "but do not worry about dates and details. Focus on preparing your heart and being receptive to the guidance you will receive. Transformation will first begin within each person before manifesting in the world outside." After sharing the warning, Jesus made a gentle gesture with his hand, and the environment around us began to transform. Suddenly, we found ourselves in a place that I can only describe as the most extraordinary library I have ever seen, although calling that place a library is extremely reductive. The space seemed infinite, with shelves stretching in every direction, as far as the eye could see and beyond. But these were no ordinary shelves. They seemed to be made of crystallized light, and the books, the books. Some floated in the air, their pages turning gently as if moved by an invisible breeze. Others glowed with colors that don't exist in our world, and there were volumes that seemed to be made of pure energy. "Here," Jesus said, his voice echoing with reverence, "is the knowledge of all humanity. Every soul has the potential to grow, learn, and become more complete. This is the gift and burden of humanity." As we walked through the shelves, I realized there were more than just books. There were ancient scrolls that floated in the air, musical scores that emitted soft melodies as we approached, and crystalline spheres that contained what appeared to be vivid memories. At one point, Jesus stopped in front of a particular section. A book stood out and floated towards us. His pages began to turn, and I saw images forming in the air above him. They were scenes from human history, but not like we learn about in history books. It was as if we could see not only the events, but also the invisible emotions, thoughts, and connections between the people involved. Every human life, Jesus explained, is like a chapter in an infinite book. Every choice, every thought, every act of kindness or cruelty is recorded here, not for judgment, but as part of the great story of the evolution of human consciousness. As he spoke, I noticed that some of the shelves held books that seemed unfinished, their pages still being written by an unseen force. "These are stories still in development," Jesus explained, noticing my curiosity. "Every decision we make adds new pages to our story." Gabriel, who had been following us in silence, reached out and touched one of the crystalline spheres. Immediately, the air around us was filled with the sound of children's laughter, mixed with cries of pain, celebrations of joy, and laments of loss. It was as if we could hear the symphony of the human experience in all its complexity. "This place," Jesus continued, "is not just a repository of knowledge. It is a testimony to the infinite potential that every soul carries. Every person who has ever lived or will live has their own volume here, their own contributions to the great story of existence." I was amazed to notice that some of the books appeared to be interconnected by strands of light, forming complex patterns that stretched across the shelves. "It's the connections," Jesus explained. "Each life is connected to countless others, creating a web of relationships and influences that stretches across time and space. Jesus turned to me with a look that mixed love and a certain sadness. "Now, you must go back," he said softly. I felt my heart tighten. I didn't want to leave that place of infinite peace and understanding. It was as if, for the first time in my life, I was truly at home. "Fear not," Jesus continued, sensing my hesitation, "for I will be with you always. What you have experienced here will remain in your heart, even if some details are lost in translation to earthly consciousness." Gabriel approached, and, with a gentle gesture, touched my chest, right over my heart. At the moment of touch, I felt an indescribable energy course through my entire being. It was as if he was sealing all those experiences inside me, ensuring that the essence of what I learned would not be lost upon return. It was then that I began to feel a kind of tug. It was as if an invisible thread, anchored somewhere far away, began to call me back. The images around me began to become less clear, as if they were dissolving into a golden haze. As the feeling of return intensified, I began to hear distant sounds, first very soft, then increasingly clearer. There were beeps from heart monitors, muffled voices of people speaking in urgent tones, the metallic sound of surgical instruments. The pain also began to return, first as a distant tingling, then gradually intensifying. It was as if every nerve in my body was slowly waking up, remembering the trauma suffered in the accident. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was Dr. Green's tired face. He was leaning over me, beads of sweat on his forehead, an expression of relief replacing the tension on his face. "Welcome back," he said, with an exhausted smile. The bright light in the operating room made me blink several times. It was so different from the soft, welcoming light I had experienced moments before. The contrast was almost painful, not just physically, but spiritually as well. A nurse quickly approached when she realized I was conscious. "You gave us quite a scare," she said, adjusting something in the IV. "We lost you for a few minutes there." Dr. Green was still watching me closely. He would later tell me that, during the surgery, there was a moment when everyone thought they would lose me permanently. My heart had stopped for almost 4 minutes, and they were about to declare death when, inexplicably, the heartbeat returned. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and sore from the breathing tube that had been removed. I wanted to tell them everything I had experienced, everything I had learned, but at that moment, only silent tears ran down my face. The days that followed were a confusing mix of physical pain and spiritual clarity. I was hospitalized for 2 weeks at Denver General Hospital, recovering from multiple fractures and extensive surgery. My mother, Margaret, practically moved into the hospital, sleeping in that uncomfortable chair next to my bed, holding my hand in the darkest hours. It was to her that I first told about my experience. I was hesitant at first, worried that she would think I had lost my mind from the pain medications. But as I spoke, I saw tears forming in his eyes. When I mentioned seeing a man with white hair and red suspenders standing next to Jesus, she turned pale. "Asher," she said, her voice shaking, "you just described your great-grandfather Charles. He died before you were even born. I never showed you pictures of him. And those red suspenders were his trademark. He wore them. I used it every day." Dr. Green also took a particular interest in my experience. During one of his visits, after checking my vital signs, he sat on the edge of the bed and told me something that was troubling him. "Sir, during his surgery," he said, lowering his voice, "when his heart stopped, I was about to pronounce him dead. But then I heard a voice. It wasn't a normal voice, and it was like it came from inside my chest, head, telling me not to give up. I had never experienced anything like that in 30 years in the profession. The visits began to become more frequent as news of my experience spread. Nurses who weren't on their shift stopped to chat. Other hospital patients asked to visit me. Each person who heard my story seemed to find something in it that touched their own life in some way. The driver who hit me, a young man named Michael, came to visit me a week after the accident. He was devastated, crying and asking for forgiveness repeatedly. He told me that he had fallen asleep at the wheel after a 16-hour shift at his job as a security guard. Instead of anger, I felt deep compassion for him. I shared a little of my experience and saw how it affected him. Before leaving, he hugged me, promising that he would change his life. I later learned that he had gone back to school and become a counselor at a rehabilitation center. My co-workers also came to visit, bringing cards and flowers. It was strange seeing them outside the office environment. For the first time, I was able to see them not just as colleagues, but as complete people. each with their own story, their own fears and dreams. It was during those 2 weeks in the hospital that I began to realize how the experience was changing not only me, but also the people around me. Each person who listened to my story seemed to leave the room a little different, as if something inside them had awakened, even if just a little. It's been a few months since I was released from the hospital and returned to work. The physical scars are mostly healed, but the inner transformation I experienced continues to deepen every day. The life I lead now is completely different from the one before the accident, even though externally it may seem similar. I still work at the same consulting company in Denver, but my approach to work has changed radically. The spreadsheets and reports that before seemed to me just lifeless numbers, I now see as tools that can impact people's lives. When I analyze a company's data, I think about the employees behind those numbers, the families who depend on those jobs. My meetings are different now. I make a point of really listening to people, of seeing beyond the professional masks we all wear. Sometimes, when someone is presenting a project, I find myself thinking about what I saw in the celestial library, how our every action has consequences that extend far beyond what we can imagine. At home, I have been dedicating more time to my family. Every Sunday is now sacred. I go to my parents' house for lunch, something I always found excuses to put off before. My mother Margaret says my eyes are different, more alive, more present. She's right. It's like I've woken up from a long sleep and am truly seeing the world for the first time. I stay in regular contact with Dr. Green. We developed an unlikely but deep friendship. Sometimes we meet for coffee and talk about life, death, and the mysteries between the two. He told me that after my surgery, he began paying more attention to his patients, reports of spiritual experiences. Medicine doesn't have all the answers, he told me recently, and maybe it doesn't need to. I didn't create any study groups, write books, or become a spiritual guru. That's not my role. I only share my experience when I feel someone really needs to hear it. It's surprising how the right people seem to cross my path at the right times. The date mentioned by Jesus regarding divine intervention has not yet arrived, but I feel a deep peace about it. I learned that every moment is too precious to waste worrying about the future. My role is simply to be present, to be an instrument of love and understanding in the here and now. People sometimes ask me if I'm afraid of death after this experience. The truth is that death has completely lost its power over me. What I saw and experienced on the other side fundamentally changed my understanding of existence. Now I know that death is not an end. It is just a passage, a change of state. I still have a lot to learn and a lot to experience. Every morning when I wake up, I am grateful for the new chance I have received. I'm not a special person. I'm just someone who had the privilege of taking a peek beyond the veil and came back to tell the story. The true message I bring is not about death, but about how to live, with love, presence, and gratitude for each precious moment given to us.